Our reading this morning will be from the book of Mark, chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. Mark 12, 13 through 17. Then they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at." They brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were amazed at him.
Good morning. It's good to be back home. I have to tell you that last week at this time, or actually a little while from now, I was sitting on the beach in Destin, Florida, and walking out into the water. My son, who's a pansy in the Air Force, and it's not because he's in the Air Force that he's a pansy. He was walking in the water and said, "Oh, this is too cold." It's like, dude, this was great. And as glad as I was to be there at that time to get to visit with him, I was a little upset that I was missing the snow back home. You see, I like the snow better than the sand. See, the good thing about snow is whenever it gets, between your toes and around your fingers and stuff like that, it's going to melt away and dry off. When sand gets there, I think there's still sand there a week later. Enjoyed the opportunity to go and see David. We had a great time with him, and while we were there, we had an opportunity also to go and visit with my uncles and aunts and cousins out in Florida. They haven't been there long. One uncle's been there just over a year, and the other got there in September. And then both of them were hit by the hurricane in October, and they had some damage. And one uncle was telling me, he said, we were watching TV, and it said, it was a tropical storm that had come up, and thought, well, we can live through a tropical storm. We'll stay here. And then it said it might get up to a Category 2, and about that time they lost power, and they didn't have any other information coming in. So it wasn't until after they rode out the storm that they realized it was nearly a Category 5 hurricane that hit there at Panama City Beach, Florida. And luckily their house was not damaged too much. They lost a couple of outbuildings and a lot of trees and things like that. But it was good to visit with them. I hadn't seen him in a while. And of course, my other uncle that got there in September, they did have some damage to the house, but were able to stay and keep things in order and repair things as they were happening even during the storm. And so, but it was wonderful to see our family, to spend time with them, and especially with David. There's that point at which you've been on vacation with him and he's stayed in your hotel with you every night, that you're kind of like, don't you need to go back to your room? But no, we really enjoyed that. And he was a good host, taking us all around different places, and even got to go on the Air Force Base and see some F-15s take off with their afterburners, flaming at it. It was gorgeous until it started raining on us, but it was still good. We enjoyed it a lot. But it's interesting. While I was there, David said one thing to me. He said that he didn't vote in the last election because, as he put it, he said, God is going to put into power whom he wants in power. That is a great statement of faith, and certainly we understand that God is in control, but we have to understand that God does put in power those that he wants in power, and he uses the very human institutions to accomplish that will. In other words, he uses us, Christians, to bring about his will in governmental affairs. God, or Paul would say in Romans chapter 13 and verse 4, he says, the ruler is God's servant for you for good. God looks at the government as his servant. And certainly not every servant is as faithful as other servants, and not every government is as close to the righteousness of God that he desires, but certainly that is true. Others look at the government and they eschew government itself and interaction with it because they appeal to Philippians 2 or 3 in verse 20. Our citizenship is in heaven. Certainly that is true. And the great apostle Paul, who said those very words in Acts chapter 16, mentioned that he is a citizen of Rome and used that citizenship to his advantage so that he may further the cause of Christ. Later in Acts chapter 22, he uses that same Roman citizenship. So being a citizen of the United States of America, or being a citizen of Great Britain, or a citizen of Nigeria is not mutually exclusive with being a citizen of heaven itself. Still, other Christians struggle with participating in civil affairs because none of the candidates or none of the leaders or none of the office holders are Christians, or maybe they all have moral flaws within them. Yes, they do, much like Egypt and Babylon and Rome, whom God used at different times in history as his own servants, sometimes to punish his own people, and at other times to save his own people as well. So the question comes, should Christians shun government and its elected officials, or do they have an obligation to the government itself? This has been a question that's been around the church, especially in America, for a long time. In 1913, David Lipscomb, the editor of the Gospel Advocate, wrote a book called Civil Government, Its Origin, Mission, and Destiny, and the Christian's Relationship to It. In that particular book, Lipscomb advocated the idea that Christians should separate themselves from the national government or to any state government, that there should be a separation there. In fact, what he said was he considered that it was necessary for human governments and institutions to exist. But he said it's a necessary evil, just like hell is a necessary evil. It's not good that hell exists, but it's necessary for it to exist as a place of punishment. And of course, Christians want to separate themselves from hell, just the same way he would say that human governments are a necessary evil. Of course, he is writing this on the heels of the Civil War. Some of the greatest injustices in the United States of America history that we have happened during that particular war. And he's looking at that war and he's saying Christians ought to separate themselves from that mentality and that life, just like we would want to separate ourselves from hell itself. Many, of course, disagreed with Lipscomb in those days and rejoiced in the freedom to participate in government. And I would say that debate that he was a champion of continues today. There are some who still struggle with exactly how should the Christian participate, or should he participate at all in the government that is here. During his Passion Week, the Jews escalated their confrontations with Jesus. Scott has been covering that on Sunday mornings in his Bible class, and we're in that section of Mark. We're in that last week of the life of Christ, and we see conflict coming to him over and over and over again. And so there's this escalation of conflict between Jesus and the Jews, in particular the Jewish leadership. And he is confronted by those who are the Pharisees and the Herodians in Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 13, in an attempt, it says specifically, to try and trap him over the people's obligation to government. That's really what the trap is about. The trap they set is about this very debate that has been going on for generations. What is our obligation? What is our duty to the government? So this morning, let's take some time to listen in to the confrontation that is happening in Mark chapter 12 and see what we can learn about our duty to God and government. We begin with the trap that is being set, verses 13 and 14. They sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him. We're not sure who the they is in the first statement there, they sent, but these were most likely the Sanhedrin Council, which we saw earlier in confrontation with Jesus, and they're probably sending a delegation of Pharisees and a delegation of Herodians. And they're sent, it says specifically, as an attempt to discredit Jesus. It's a conspiracy, an unholy alliance between these two. And they're trying to imperil Jesus with the punishment of Rome or the punishment of desertion by the people. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 6, there was a moment where the Pharisees leave a confrontation with Jesus. They have been whipped and their tails between their legs, and they go out and they conspire with the Herodians. And it says there in verse 6 of chapter 3 that they conspire to destroy Jesus. Mark does not have these two groups coming together again until this moment. And it appears then that this is the fulfillment of that conspiracy. All the things that they have been plotting, all the things that they've been conspiring about, it is coming to this culmination between this unholy alliance between the Herodians and the Pharisees in order to trap Jesus, to destroy him. You got to keep that in mind. They are seeking to destroy Jesus. They want to trap him in some unguarded statement in his words. They think that their question is going to do just that. The question comes up, "Teacher, we know that you are true. You do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" See, they've got him now. You see, if he says that it is not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, then he jeopardizes his own safety with the government of Rome itself. Rome expected tribute, especially from the Jews, especially from those people under their oppression, that they would pay their dues, to pay their taxes. And if Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes, then Rome would look down upon him, possibly punishing him. If insurrection is found in him, even crucifying him. On the other hand, if he says, yes, pay your taxes, many of the Jews hated the Roman oppression. The requirements of Rome, they felt, were too heavy to bear. Many of the Jews, especially those of the sect of the Zealots, actively sought the overthrow of Rome. So the idea of paying money to Rome, of paying these taxes to Rome, they hated it. And if Jesus said, yes, pay your taxes, then half or more of his followers would turn away. And he would come to nothing. He would be destroyed that way. What's interesting is that many of the Pharisees were of the group that did not want to pay their taxes. One rabbi famously refused to use any coin with anyone's image on it, because he felt that it was a form of worship and idolatry. So to use this money toward Rome, they hated it. And so many of the Jews refused to pay their taxes. But who were the Herodians? The Herodians were the Jews that had attached themselves as a contingent to Herod himself. Herod, who was the governor of the land of Palestine. Herod, who was an appointee by Rome. Herod, who was loyal to Rome first and oppressed the Jews. The Herodians were ones who actively sought taxation of the Jews on behalf of Herod. It just goes to show you the strange bedfellows they made in order to destroy Jesus. These were not two groups of people that would normally be on the same page. In fact, these two groups would have answered the question they asked separately. But it was all worthwhile if we can destroy Jesus. And they used these great words of flattery for Jesus, as if to make him let down his guard. Ironically, everything that they said is true, but nothing they said they believed. You see, he was a teacher. Teacher, we know. They didn't believe him to be a teacher. They didn't look to him to teach them anything. They were the Pharisees. They were the Herodians. They were the leaders of the Jews. What could this punk from Nazareth possibly teach us? Teacher? He had always spoken what was true. We know that you always speak the truth. And yet they didn't believe that. They believed he spoke the lie every time he opened his mouth. He did not always, or they said he did not care about people's opinions. Yet they honestly believed that Jesus was just there to get a following. And whatever he could say or do to get more people, that's what he did, because he's all about the crowds. That's what they believed. What they said was true, though. He was not swayed by appearances, literally by the countenance on their faces. Sometimes when you're preaching or teaching, you look out and you see different expressions on people's faces. Sometimes you have to have some thick skin as a preacher because the expressions aren't necessarily good. Jesus was not swayed by people's countenance, by the expression on their face. He wasn't worried if they were angry, if they were sad, if they were happy. He was there to tell the truth. He didn't even care how people responded to his teaching. He had one purpose: bring the message of God. Now, the Jews didn't believe that, but that's what he did. So this flattery was all there to maybe set him off guard, and in that way we'll trap him. But the deal is that it's a broken trap. You know, if you ever used, different kinds of traps, like a rat snap trap. Have you seen those? You pull the bale over and you set it. But what good is it if the spring is broken, right? You just flip the bale over and it doesn't do anything. The rat gets the cheese and the bale doesn't move because the spring is broken. It's a broken trap. They have set before Jesus a broken trap. Jesus was wise to their game. He says, "Why put me to the test?" This was to show them that he knew exactly what they were doing. That he knew the conspiracy. He knew the design that they had to destroy him. And he calls for a coin, which was readily available. I love this. As much as the Jews said they hated Rome, what currency did they use? Roman currency. Let me ask you this. The Jews who were very faithful, where did they go to worship? Oh, they went to the temple. Yes, this temple which was built by Herod with Roman funds. You see, they enjoyed the protections of Rome. They enjoyed Roman infrastructures, the streets and the highway system. They enjoyed Roman education. They enjoyed Roman art. They had a selective outrage against Rome. The things they liked, they accepted. The things they didn't like were the things that they wanted to reject. And this coin was readily available. Oh yeah, I got one right here. Jesus asks, whose image and inscription is on the coin? And they answered, Caesar's. Caesar's is on it. That's why we hate it, because it's Rome, it's Caesar. The coin of the day, of course, would have been the Tiberius denarius, with the image of Tiberius Caesar Augustus. In fact, the inscription said, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus. The coin was a reflection of one of the major religions in Roman society, which was the emperor cult. The emperor himself was a deity. Tiberius here is shown as a demigod, son of a god. Augustus, he says, who is divine. It played into the Caesar worship that was so common in Rome at that day. Despite the coin being a token of this emperor cult, Jesus made the declaration, right? Render to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God. It's interesting. Jesus sets before the people a duty to both God and to Caesar. Caesar here representative of the human government. Despite how corrupt the human governments are, we still have a duty to them as citizens. Paul would say much the same thing in Romans chapter 13, submitting to this same Roman government, submitting to this same Caesar. Jesus says, render to Caesar who thinks himself to be a God. Is he a righteous man? Not hardly. But Jesus says we have an obligation, a duty to serve him. It should be noted that Jesus is not here equating the two. Render unto Caesar's, that's one entity, and unto God, which is another entity, and the two are equal entities. You have the human institution and the spiritual institution. That's not what Jesus is saying. Rather, he would say that our obedience to country is part of our obedience to God. In other words, when we render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, we are also rendering to God the things that are God, because God expects such duty. But we have to understand this: God supersedes man. I love what Jesus says, whose image? You realize the word image there is used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament in a very particular place. It's in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. That's the discussion of God, right? So it might go something like this. Whose image is on the coin? Oh, Caesar's. Whose image is on Caesar? Whose image is on Caesar? God's. Who is more important, the coin or Caesar? Caesar. Who's more important, Caesar or God? God. See, we have to keep them in their proper places. We don't say, well, Christians have a duty to government and think that government is somehow equal in status to God. It's not. The Christian's duty to government. I'm going to give you 4 points and we'll finish. Number one, we render our taxes. I know that's not popular, and some of us are thankful for tax cuts, some are not thankful for tax cuts. Whether there's tax cuts or not, we're obligated to pay them. How much of our taxes should we pay? All of them. Do we have to pay more? No. If the government asks you for $20, how much do you owe? $20. Don't pay them $19.99 and don't pay them $20.01. Pay them what you owe. This context, of course, proves that. But think about the temple tax, for example, in Matthew chapter 17, when they asked Jesus about paying the temple tax, and he tells Peter to go and throw his hook into the water, and the first fish that he catches open its mouth, and the temple tax was going to be in the fish's mouth. What is Jesus doing? He's paying his taxes. In Luke 13, when the tax collectors came to John to be baptized, and they're all asking, the soldiers asked, and the people are asking, and the tax collector asked the same question. What do we need to do? In other words, in order to be right, to be disciples, what do we need to do? And John said, well, as you know, Christians have no part in the government, so quit your jobs. No, in verse 13, what he says is, don't take any more taxes than what's required. In other words, if someone owes $20, don't go to him and say, yeah, you owe $25 and pocket the extra $5. That's why the people hated the tax collectors. They were doing that every day. He says, you need to take only what is required. Paul told Christians to submit to governments in Romans chapter 13 and verse 7, paying to all what is due. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, Respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. We must render our taxes. Number 2, we must render our obedience. Obey the laws of the land. 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, or some translations, every human ordinance. Everything the government tells you to do. Now, obviously, if it tells you to contradict the law of God, you have to obey God rather than men, Acts chapter 5, right? But if there's no contradiction, as unpleasant as it may be, we obey that law. Titus 3 and verse 1, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities and to be obedient, to be ready for every good work. Romans 13, 1 through 7, we've mentioned already, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Number 3, we must render our morality, our righteousness, because Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation. God wanted his people to be an influence of righteousness, even in the nation of Israel. The problem was they didn't follow that up. But God has used his people in governmental offices to be moral guidance to them. Jesus says we are lights of the world. Let our lights shine, that others may see our good works and glorify our Father who's in heaven. Matthew 5, 14 through 16. Christian morality led the way in the abolition of slavery, in equal rights and treatment for women, in the civil rights. Christianity led the way. We owe our morality to help steer our government in a way that will be a blessing to everyone. And then number 4, we render our participation. God has always used people in the seats of government throughout history to bring about his will. Think of Joseph, second in all the land of Egypt, only answers to who? Pharaoh. The second highest political figure in the land. To save Egypt, because Egypt was a bastion of righteousness, wasn't it? Egypt was where everyone was doing everything that was right. No. God saved a wicked nation, because in so doing, he saved his own nation. What about Daniel? By Daniel chapter 2, after he's interpreted the great dream, Nebuchadnezzar is so impressed with him and his wisdom that he sets him up as one of the satraps. But that was involuntary. Daniel didn't want to do that. No. Then why did Daniel say, by the way, let's also make Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? My first order of business, Nebuchadnezzar, is can you also make my 3 friends in these political positions of authority? And he did. If Daniel was involuntary, those 3 were at least voluntary. But that was all because Babylon finally came to understand and know that there is one true and living God and served him faithfully. No, Nebuchadnezzar may have come to somewhat of that conclusion, but the nation didn't. And certainly the rulers that followed after him didn't. Well, what about Nehemiah? Serving in the palace in Shushan. A cupbearer to the king. A position of advice, a cabinet position to a king. God used him in that position to help restore the exiles to Jerusalem. Tax collectors working for the government weren't told to leave their position. You stay there.
You do what you're supposed to do. You know, in the American experiment, our government is, as Lincoln said, of the people, by the people, and for the people. The USA allows people at every level of every background to participate in the government through their voice, through their vote, through demonstrations and protest, and even through office holding. Everyone can do those things. Anyone in here could run for office. Anyone in here can stand on a street corner and pass out flyers. Anyone in here can go to the voting booth and vote. Those are the freedoms and opportunities that we have. And it has long been said of the Christian, where there is ability and where there is opportunity, there's responsibility. We don't normally use it in this context. But if we have the ability to affect the government, to affect the direction, to affect its decisions, and we have an opportunity to, whether it's on television, in a newspaper article, talking to our friends and our coworkers, our family, making a vote, or running for office, there's a responsibility that comes up. You know, when history looks back on our day, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, you know how we like to look back at history and we assess what was going on in those days. When people look at us and they're going to see some blights on American culture in the early 21st century. But let me tell you something. They're not going to look at it and say, look at how they treated women. They're not going to look back 100 years from now and say, look at how racism was such a blight. They're not going to look at it and say, homophobia was the problem. I believe they're going to look back and say, how could those people consent to killing 1,700 babies a day? How? How can they devalue life to that point? That's what they're going to be asking. You see, when life is devalued, when human life doesn't mean anything, then selfishness and meanness and greed and hate and other cultural rot will reign over the fall of every nation. It happened in Rome. It happened in Babylon. And it will happen in the United States of America. I don't know if that fall will be complete in 100 years. If it is, they're going to look back and they're going to say, what in the world caused the downfall of such a prosperous nation? And the answer is, we didn't care about life. They're going to ask that question. Where was the Christian majority that claimed to be a Christian nation? Where is that Christian majority to stop such evil as abortion? Where was it? And our best answer is going to be, we weren't sure if we should participate in the government. There are too many moral flaws. Or we'll say something like, we didn't want to get involved in civil matters. We are spiritual people, citizens of heaven. Or we're going to say, we weren't single issue voters. May God have mercy on us. If that's our best excuse for the Christian majority, staying home, or worse, voting for their personal causes instead of God's cause. God is in control in the kingdoms of men, setting in power whom he wills, as well as the institution that he's willed. And he works through the structures of those institutions and those personalities to bring about his will. Just as Paul used his citizenship to his advantage to help advance the cause of Christ, every Christian should be savvy enough to use their citizenship on this earth, in this country, or any other country, we might say, to help advance the cause of Christ. We have a great opportunity to participate in our government, affect its directions. And listen, we look back 100 years, and it took a while for Christians to speak up about slavery. It took a little while for Christians to speak up about equality of men and women. We eventually got there, but it took a while. And it took a while for Christians to speak up about civil rights. We eventually got there, but it took too long. And it's taken a while in the abortion era. Let's render unto God by rendering a better influence to Caesar, stemming the tide of America's culture of death, and elevating and valuing life. Let's be the citizens God wants us to be, both of heaven and of earth. I don't know what this does to your heart. But when I think about life issues in a developed country like ours, we are in a sad state of affairs. And if we as Christians sit this one out, who is going to stand up for the voiceless, the most vulnerable among us? Satan worshipers? Secularists? The greedy? The powerful? Who do you think is going to stand up for the unborn? History has shown no one else will. But we can. Maybe this morning you've been struggling with the whole idea of what duty do I have to God and what duty do I have to government. Jesus is very clear. We have a duty to both. Maybe you found it hard to find your place exactly. Don't give up. God has a place for you. Maybe you've been running away from the obligations. Don't run away. Embrace the gift that God has given you. Embrace the gift that God offers you, which begins this morning with salvation. Look, if you're separated from God, God wants you. God wants you this morning. He wants you to obey the gospel. He wants you to leave this building saved, and you can. If this morning you respond to his invitation while we stand and while we sing.